No matter how far back in time you look, people have always been interested in the end of the world. A common theme in stories about the end is the collapse of civilization, and I think it's a pretty reasonable interest. After all, we are in the midst of the 6th mass extinction on Earth, and the fossils tell us that most species aren't around forever. So it's got me thinking, could everything humanity built up to this point collapse? And if so, how? Today we're going to dive into some potential triggers for a collapse, but since your time is valuable, I've gone ahead and made some timestamps, so feel free to check them out if you want to skip to whatever interests you most. But I would recommend sticking through to the end, that way you can understand everything to its fullest. Anyways, my name is Christian and welcome to Orbiter, where we talk about stuff like this and how technologies today could help us become a Type 1 civilization. So if you're interested in improving the world and discussing the potential future of humanity, subscribe for more. But either way, let's get into this. What could destroy the internet, satellites, electrical grids, and the entire global financial system all at once? Solar storms. These are essentially what happens when the sun emits huge electrically charged bursts of energy in the direction of Earth. Astronomers discovered these things at a pretty convenient time in humanity's history, 1859, later known as the Carrington event. It was a big one that damaged electrical systems globally, but mostly affected telegraphs. You know, the clicky things. We were lucky then because barely anything ran on electricity, but today, literally every industry depends on reliable electrical equipment. If a large solar storm hit Earth now, the lifestyles we enjoy could be postponed for up to 2 years and cost up to $2 trillion. But that's just in the US. Another important piece of context is that researchers estimate a 12% chance that a Carrington-sized solar storm is going to hit Earth within the next 20 years. Thankfully, engineers are aware of this and have measures to prepare, but sometimes even with all the funding and knowledge needed, mistakes can happen. Like in the recent 2020 Texas winter storms, where officials knew that their grid needed to be weatherproofed, but funding slipped through the cracks and it led to 210 deaths. Now that was just a couple weeks with intermittent power, so take a second to appreciate how terrible it would be if a chunk of humanity was suddenly without an electrical system. It would lead to massive economic destabilization, and people would gradually discover that their societies had grown too large to sustain everyone. I'll leave it to your imagination, but practically everything in our food and sanitation systems relies on a functioning electrical grid. So if that goes, people's patience could too. 12% isn't great, but it's definitely better than the rest we're about to break down. 2020 is a year most of us will never forget, and mostly because a pandemic occurred, which rapidly changed everything from our supply chains to our standards of personal space. It's shown that a pandemic's impact on economies, lifespans, and emotional stability is immeasurable. What's worth remembering though is that the virus top of mind today could have been much more deadly, and many researchers have been warning us of that for a long time. Sometimes microbes mutate to become more deadly, like the 1918 flu, which may have killed tens of millions of people. And after this past year and a half, it's clear to me that we aren't ready for anything like that. One of the main reasons for this is that people are traveling further and faster than ever, increasing the rate of disease spread across the world. Even if all future travel had better contact tracing or testing, it doesn't mean much considering new zoonotic diseases are on the rise, and antibiotic-resistant mutations are occurring more often. The solutions to these issues is worthy of its own video, so I've already gone ahead and made one and you can check it out right up here. But to summarize, the overprescription of antibiotics and increasing contact with vector animals is proving to be our downfall. Misinformation about vaccinations is also a clear risk, based off recent data in the US at least. Fortunately for this kind of collapse, we have historical data on how pandemics typically play out. Using the worst plague as an example, the Black Death, there's evidence that it took up to 200 million lives and weakened empires. But over time, people's bodies and behaviors adapted. Although the damages of a pandemic can be enormous and should be mitigated ahead of time, the likelihood of a total collapse is actually kind of low, ignoring all possible Walking Dead scenarios, of course. Instead, like this past year and many other pandemics, societal unrest and temporary power vacuums are likely to occur, but its effects will impact the most impoverished countries disproportionately. Now, if these last two have bummed you out, take a second and appreciate the fact that you're alive. Because during the Cold War, there were at least 22 known occasions where nuclear war could have wiped out the majority of humanity. Despite that civilization-ending potential, 9 countries on Earth still have thousands of nuclear weapons pointed at each other. Now, to give you a sense of scale, modern-day nuclear bombs can be up to 3,000 times more powerful than the nukes dropped on Japan during World War II, and they would spread radiation much further. The tragic destruction these weapons can cause is widely known, but there are some people out there claiming that the threat of nuclear war has actually introduced an era of peace. Mutually assured destruction prevents violence, apparently. Only thing is, several of these nuclear-armed countries are increasing their supply of weapons and upgrading old ones. In fact, reports on increased international military spending is indicating yet another Cold War-like arms race as we speak. This is really dangerous, because sometimes all it takes is a little bit of economic insecurity or racial tensions for very cruel people to come into power. With history as our reference, we can safely assume it'll happen again. And knowing that a single country has the ability to end billions of lives or blot out the sun is too much power for a fraction of humanity to have. Lots of assumptions are needed to estimate the true risk of nuclear fallout or nuclear war, but a Stanford professor has published a paper speculating a 10% chance. Only thing is, that was 8 years ago. Going forward, nation-states may not be the biggest danger, since 3D printing technology is expected to continue improving, so average consumers can manufacture anything from a gun to the internal components of a missile. Of course, it'll always be hard for civilians to obtain stuff like plutonium, but it's not impossible. And the advent of 3D printing definitely introduces unexpected risks to global security, despite how cool those machines can be. I'd say the majority of ways civilization could collapse is from unexpected triggers. But there is one we've been aware of for decades now, which is an ecological collapse. To summarize the causes of this potential trigger, it mostly deals with the fact that societies have recently become technologically advanced enough to extract resources faster than the Earth can replenish them. And by recent, I mean a couple hundred years ago. In addition, the natural cycles on the planet are altering faster than usual because of increasing greenhouse gases and polluted materials that don't biodegrade quickly, like plastic. But most importantly, the lungs of the planet are currently getting burned down, or in the case of phytoplankton, are struggling to survive in a toxic ocean. That was a lot, but worth knowing since many of those changes will affect a lot of your life going forward. Some impacts are guaranteed, while many others have the potential to be mitigated with technology or a change in consumption patterns. Let's say nothing is done. One projected outcome from this kind of collapse is the literal division of civilization, primarily seen through the rising sea levels, which will submerge land that's below sea level and create mass migration. Climate refugees can already be seen today, and more are expected, but over time, if entire regions experience more droughts or challenges in food production, it could trigger violent collapses in nearby countries if there aren't enough resources to share. In response to this, powerful countries have been preemptively ramping up border defense and isolationist policies in recent years. Likely because massive power vacuums and wars may occur in order to control the dwindling resources on Earth. As it stands, the majority of climate researchers believe significant damage can be expected in the coming years, and the short term is looking bleak. But despite that, I optimistically think this kind of collapse is unlikely to kill off the human race. but more directly, may destroy supply chains, create new global power structures, and see a sustained reduction in our standard of living. Sometimes a collapse is inevitable, but ironically, they can act as a turning point that leads to continued progress and more individual freedom. I would refer to this as a productive collapse, which typically occur when societies become economically stratified, where wealth and power is concentrated within a small group of people. Although rigid class systems and hoarding of wealth can work for many generations, that outcome seems to always impact the long-term viability of an empire or a country. A common historical trend deals with the compounding of intergenerational inequalities, where workers or discriminated people get fed up and organize to claim their perceived share of the wealth. This pattern in global societies has shown itself in many of the major collapses over time, like with the Roman Empire, the Persian Empire, and some even speculate that the US is well positioned to fall as well. Currently, global income and wealth inequalities are at their worst since the Great Depression, with the top 10% of income earners owning the majority of all the wealth in the world, all while huge chunks of the world lack access to healthcare, water, and food. Technology has made it way easier for people to consolidate wealth, but because of things like the internet, an awakening to the structural inequalities is becoming more well known, thus increasing reactionary sentiment to burn it all to the ground. History shows that inequality-driven collapses leads to a lot of death, and that needs to be avoided at all costs. But it's clear that people across the world are economically dissatisfied, which can lead to violent power grabs that sometimes creates new nations. Economic crises are leading contributors for civilization collapse, but on the flip side of things, they can provide a potential future that incentivizes less inequality and better systems for managing societal wealth. Needless to say, there's a lot of ways civilization could break down. In fact, a lot of the main ways it could are likely unknown to us still, but you probably know that. After all, that fear has worked its way into almost every part of our cultures, stretching from most religions to the most memed movies. The prospect of losing everything has always concerned humanity, and likely for good reasons. At the same time though, there's a tendency for us to cope with these fears by becoming detached from the issues that feel too big or out of our control. It's unfortunate, but not impossible to overcome. One solution could be as easy as joining the Orbiter community. So let me know down in the comments section what you think humanity could do to solve any of the problems we've discussed so far. After all, making an impact on this kind of stuff can be really tough, but starting the discussion is a really great first step because it can help inspire people to make that change and take an action. In fact, that's what this entire channel's content is all about. But yeah, that's it for this one, and if you're still curious what a Type 1 civilization is and why I want to make one in my lifetime, check out either of these two videos. They'll give you all the info you need. And remember, keep orbiting, because if this video taught you anything, that's not guaranteed without some forward-thinking Earthlings.